Ethan Mercer slammed the folder shut. He had read the same complaint 3 times, and each time his jaw tightened a little more. A 67-year-old woman named Patricia Osei had written 4 paragraphs describing how she stood at a Blue Horizon gate for 38 minutes, cane in hand, asking for wheelchair assistance, while 3 staff members looked through her like she was made of glass. She eventually dragged herself to the boarding door alone. Nobody apologized. Nobody even looked up. That letter alone would have been enough to rattle him. But it wasn't alone. It sat on top of a stack, 40 letters thick. Ethan pushed back from his desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office on the 22nd floor. Below him, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Taxis, pedestrians, delivery trucks, normal, orderly, indifferent to the fire quietly building inside one of the most powerful men in the airline industry. He had built Blue Horizon Airways from nothing, not from family money, not from investors who believed in him. From the start, he had built it from stubbornness and a second-hand Bombardier turboprop he'd bought at auction 27 years ago. Before he could even afford a proper office, he flew routes that no major carrier wanted. Small towns, rural airports, communities that the big players had written off as unprofitable. He personally handed out boarding passes. He personally loaded luggage when the ground crew was short, and his motto, printed on the very first Blue Horizon employee handbook, was 4 words that he meant with every cell in his body. Every traveler deserves dignity. Now Blue Horizon had 63 aircraft, millions of passengers every year, hubs in 8 cities, awards on his wall, a profile in a national business magazine that called him the conscience of regional aviation, and a stack of 40 complaints that suggested his conscience had gone missing somewhere along the way. His executive team had explanations, of course. His VP of operations, a polished man named Gerald, had sat across from him in the boardroom just 2 weeks earlier and delivered those explanations with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed them. Disgruntled travelers, Gerald said, social media amplification, isolated incidents inflated by online negativity, one hub that was chronically understaffed and doing its best under difficult conditions, nothing that a few new hires and a revised scheduling model wouldn't fix. Ethan had nodded slowly and said nothing. But Gerald had not read the letter from Patricia Osei. Gerald had not read the one from the father of a mixed-race family who said a Blue Horizon agent had spoken to his wife in a tone so dismissive it made his teenage daughter cry. Gerald had not read the one from the 82-year-old veteran who said he had been flying commercially for 50 years and had never once felt invisible until he boarded a Blue Horizon flight at Rivergate International. The complaints were not random. They were not scattered. They clustered around one hub, one terminal, one consistent pattern of behavior. And they described something that went beyond bad days and staffing shortages. They described a culture, a way of seeing passengers not as people, but as variables. Some worth attention, most worth none. Ethan turned from the window. He picked up his phone and called 2 people. His attorney, Carol Sims, and his personal assistant, James Tao. He told them what he was planning. He told them to keep it between the 3 of them. Carol spent 6 minutes trying to talk him out of it and then accepted that she couldn't. James asked 0 questions and started making arrangements before the call was over. 3 days later, Ethan Mercer ceased to exist. In his place stood Nathan Reed, a mid-level logistics consultant from Columbus, Ohio, traveling to a client meeting. Nathan Reed had a driving license, a modest carry-on suitcase, a Blue Horizon economy ticket purchased online with a prepaid card, and absolutely nothing else to distinguish him from the 11 million other Americans who fly budget seats every year. No elite status, no upgrade request, no name that anyone in the industry would recognize. He wore a plain gray jacket, dark jeans, and a pair of worn leather shoes he'd specifically chosen because they didn't look expensive. He arrived at Rivergate International on a Tuesday morning At 6:45, he stood in the check-in line. He waited. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The line moved slowly, not because the system was overloaded, but because the two agents working the economy counter were having a conversation with each other that they seemed entirely unwilling to interrupt. When a young couple, at the front of the line, politely asked a question, one agent answered without making eye contact, gestured vaguely toward a screen, and returned to her conversation. Ethan said nothing. He watched. When he finally reached the counter, the agent took his ID, printed his boarding pass, and slid it across without a word or a glance. He picked it up and moved on. At the security checkpoint, a man in a tailored suit and the kind of shoes that do look expensive walked in through a priority lane. An agent greeted him by name, smiled genuinely, and wished him a pleasant flight with a warmth that seemed to come from a completely different workplace than the one Ethan had just experienced at the economy counter. He filed this away, said nothing, moved through security. He found a seat near gate 14 and watched. And in 20 minutes of watching, he saw more than his executive team had apparently seen in months. He saw an elderly man ask for directions and get pointed at a departure board with zero further assistance. He saw a woman struggling with an oversized carry-on while two uniformed staff members stood nearby, arms folded, watching her wrestle it onto a baggage cart alone. He saw a gate agent roll her eyes, visibly, unmistakably roll her eyes, when a passenger approached with a question. But then he saw something else. At the adjacent gate, a young woman in a Blue Horizon uniform was crouched down to eye level with a small child who had dropped a stuffed animal and was on the edge of tears. She picked it up, handed it back, said something that made the child laugh, then straightened up and immediately turned her full attention to an elderly couple who needed help reading their boarding passes. She walked them through it, step by step, without impatience, without performance, without any awareness at all that Ethan was watching her from 30 feet away. He looked at her name badge, Maya Bennett. He sat back in his seat. He had 4 days ahead of him. He had no idea yet just how much those 4 days were going to cost certain people and change others forever. Flight 728 departed at 9:15. Ethan sat in seat 24C. Middle seat economy, exactly as booked. To his left, a college student with headphones who fell asleep before takeoff. To his right, a middle-aged woman named Donna, who told him within the first 3 minutes that she was flying to see her daughter's new baby and hadn't slept in 2 days from excitement. He smiled genuinely and told her congratulations. She beamed like she'd won something. He noticed that small exchange stayed with him, how little it cost, how much it meant to her. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with the efficiency of people executing a checklist rather than serving human beings. Not rude, exactly. Just absent. Present in body, gone in spirit. Eye contact was rare. Smiles were rarer. When a mother, 3 rows ahead, struggled to collapse a stroller while simultaneously holding a toddler on her hip and keeping a second child from crawling under the seat, not one crew member moved to help. Ethan watched 2 of them pass her twice. The mother's face cycled through frustration, exhaustion, and the quiet resignation of someone who had learned not to expect help from strangers. Then Maya appeared from the front of the cabin. She wasn't assigned to that section. That much was clear from the brief glance exchanged between her and a senior flight attendant who noticed her moving toward the back. But Maya either didn't see the look or chose not to care. She reached the mother, took the stroller with one smooth motion, collapsed it in 4 seconds, slid it into the overhead bin, and handed the toddler a small pack of crackers from her pocket like she'd been expecting exactly this moment. The mother looked at her like she might cry. Maya just smiled, said something quiet, and moved back toward her section. Ethan stared at his tray table for a long moment. He had spent 27 years believing that the culture of a company lived in its training programs, its mission statements, its leadership retreats and quarterly reviews. He was beginning to understand, sitting in seat 24C, that culture actually lived in moments. exactly like the one he had just witnessed. Moments where nobody was watching, moments where the choice to help cost something. Time, energy, the mild disapproval of a senior colleague. And someone made that choice anyway. And moments where the choice not to help cost nothing visible. And most people made that choice instead. He opened the Notes app on his phone and began typing. He was still typing when he overheard the conversation. It was coming from the galley, 2 rows behind him. 2 crew members, voices low but not low enough, speaking with the comfortable carelessness of people who assume passengers are either asleep or indifferent. Ethan kept his eyes on his phone and his ears wide open. The first voice was describing a passenger in row 7, a man who had asked for an extra pillow and then complained when the offered one smelled stale. The crew member's tone was not one of professional frustration. It was contempt, open, unguarded contempt for a man whose name he didn't know, delivered with a fluency that suggested this was not an unusual conversation. Then, the second voice said something that made Ethan go completely still. She said, "He's a time drain anyway. I clocked him when he boarded." The first voice laughed quietly. "Yeah, I had 3 of them in my section this morning. Meanwhile, the priority faces in 12 and 14 wanted for nothing." Ethan kept his face perfectly neutral. His thumb moved slowly across his phone screen. He was no longer typing notes. He was recording. Priority faces, time drains. He had heard a lot of corporate language in his career, synergies, optimization, guest journey mapping, but he had never heard a system so simple, so ugly, and so perfectly descriptive of everything the complaint letters had been trying to tell him. Somewhere inside Blue Horizon's Rivergate operation, someone had built an informal classification system for human beings, and the crew had adopted it so completely that they used it in casual conversation, mid-flight, without the slightest hesitation. He landed, collected his carry-on, and took a cab to the airport hotel, where James had booked him a standard room under Nathan Reed's name. He sat on the edge of the bed and called Carol. "It's worse than the letters," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How much worse?" "I don't know the full shape of it yet. I need more time." He extended the operation by 3 days. What followed was methodical and exhausting, and, at points, deeply personal, in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. He spent time in the terminal at different hours observing different shifts. He rode 2 more Blue Horizon flights as a connecting passenger. He sat in the airport cafe and struck up conversations with ground staff on their breaks, presenting himself as a frequent flyer, curious about how the airline worked. People talk to curious strangers in airport cafes in ways they never talk to HR departments. He learned more in those conversations over bad coffee than he suspected had ever appeared in any official report. The station manager's name was Victor Kane. Ethan had seen the name in operational reports before, a reliable, if unremarkable, performer who had run the Rivergate hub for 6 years. What the operational reports had not captured, and what 3 separate employees described to Ethan in 3 separate conversations, without any of them knowing he was the same person, was that Victor Kane had built something at Rivergate that had almost nothing to do with operational performance and almost everything to do with personal control. Victor's inner circle received the best shifts, the easiest routes, the flexibility to swap schedules without penalty, performance reviews that somehow always landed in this satisfactory to excellent range, regardless of what customers reported. When complaints came in about specific staff members, Victor filtered them. When employees outside his circle raised concerns, those concerns had a way of disappearing between the moment they were submitted and the moment they were supposed to reach regional management. One of the employees Ethan spoke to, a quiet man named Desmond, who worked baggage handling and had the careful speech of someone who had learned to be cautious, described submitting a formal report 14 months ago about a gate agent who had made a racially offensive remark to a passenger. He had filed it through the internal system. He had received an automated acknowledgement, and he had never heard another word about it. He had assumed the system worked and the issue was handled. It hadn't been. Ethan later confirmed this himself, and then there was Maya. The more time Ethan spent at Rivergate, the more her name surfaced. not in the way Victor's name surfaced, not with resentment or warning. Her name came up the way a landmark comes up when you're lost. People pointed toward her. A gate agent named Suki, who had worked the Rivergate hub for 3 years, described her in terms that were almost reverent. "She's the one who actually cares," Suki said, stirring her coffee slowly. "She wrote up this whole program, right? For how to treat passengers better. Real specific stuff. How to greet people. How to handle complaints. How to make economy feel like it matters. She trained half our team on it informally. And it worked. Our scores went up. Passengers were leaving compliments with actual names in them." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What happened to the program?" Suki's expression shifted. Something between bitterness and resignation settled across her face. "Victor happened," she said. "He took it upstairs with his name on it. Got a bonus. Got a plaque. She got nothing." And when she said something about it privately to one of the regional managers, suddenly her shift evaluations started coming back with comments about attitude problems. Suki shook her head slowly. "There are no attitude problems. I work with her every day. She's the best person in this building." Ethan thanked her for the coffee and walked back toward the terminal. He moved slowly, the way a man moves when his mind is running fast in the opposite direction. 27 years, 63 aircraft, millions of passengers, and in one hub, one manager had quietly built a private kingdom where the rules existed only for the people he chose, where a woman's genuine contribution to the company he had founded had been stolen and repackaged as someone else's achievement, and where passengers were sorted into categories like inventory rather than treated like the human beings his entire airline had been built to serve. He thought about Patricia Osei and her cane. He thought about the mother with the stroller. He thought about Desmond's report sitting unread in some digital folder. And he thought about Maya Bennett, crouched at eye level with a crying child, handing back a stuffed animal, completely unaware that what she was doing in that small, quiet moment was the most accurate living definition of everything Blue Horizon Airways was supposed to be. He went back to his hotel room and called Carol again. "Get the legal team ready," he said, "and tell James I need the full evidence protocol, emails, internal reports, complaint logs, review records, everything from Rivergate going back 4 years. Ethan, all of it, Carol." She heard something in his voice that ended the conversation quickly. "I'll make the calls tonight," she said. Batch 3. Words 2001 to 3000. The evidence arrived in layers. Carol's team pulled 4 years of internal records from Rivergate, emails, complaint logs, shift reports, performance reviews, customer satisfaction surveys, anonymous feedback submissions, and interdepartmental memos. They compiled everything into a secured digital file that Ethan spent 2 full evenings working through alone in his hotel room, with the curtains drawn and a cold cup of room service coffee going untouched on the nightstand. What he found was not a single dramatic crime. It was something more insidious than that. It was a pattern so consistent and so carefully maintained that it had become invisible, the way mold becomes invisible when it grows slowly enough behind walls that nobody thinks to open. Victor Kane had not made one catastrophic decision. He had made 1,000 small ones, each individually defensible, collectively devastating. He had approved shift swaps for his preferred staff while citing policy violations to deny the same requests from others. He had marked complaint submissions as resolved without any corresponding action. He had submitted Maya's Traveler First program to regional leadership in a 12-page document with his name on the cover page and her name nowhere inside it. He had received a $4,000 performance bonus and a formal commendation letter as a result. Maya had received a shift evaluation 2 weeks later that noted, for the first time in her 6-year employment record, a concern about her collaborative attitude. Ethan read that evaluation 3 times. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, not the measured frustration of a CEO reviewing underperformance data, but the raw, uncomplicated anger of a man who recognized injustice clearly and found it intolerable. He had started this airline for people like Maya, people who showed up and gave everything and believed that doing the right thing was its own sufficient reward. He had never intended for his company to become a place where doing the right thing got you quietly punished by someone with the right title and the wrong character. He kept reading. The passenger complaint records were perhaps the most damaging element of all, not because of what they said, but because of what happened to them after they were submitted. Blue Horizon had a formal complaint management system, a digital platform where passengers could log concerns, track responses, and receive follow-up communication from the airline. Ethan had approved the investment in that system personally 4 years earlier, specifically because he wanted transparency in how customer concerns were handled. At Rivergate, under Victor's management, the system had been subverted with bureaucratic elegance. Complaints were logged. Victor was too careful to simply delete them, which would have left obvious gaps in the data. Instead, they were categorized. Complaints about staff behavior were routinely reclassified as operational issues, delays, equipment problems, environmental factors. This reclassification meant they routed away from HR and leadership review and into a general operational queue where they aged out of active stat. This reclassification meant they routed away from HR and leadership review and into a general operational queue where they aged out of active status after 90 days without triggering any mandatory response. It was not hacking, it was not forgery, it was category selection performed by whoever handled the initial intake, which, at Rivergate, was always someone from Victor's inner circle. The result was that 4 years of legitimate passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment, rude staff behavior, and service inequality had effectively vanished into an administrative fog. Regional leadership had seen clean numbers. Corporate had seen clean numbers. Ethan himself had seen clean numbers, and the numbers had lied with complete structural legitimacy. He closed the laptop at midnight and sat in the dark for a while. Then he called James. "I need the meeting room booked," he said. "Rivergate conference facility, large enough for the full station leadership team plus 6 corporate executives. Make it look like a regional performance review. Standard agenda, no unusual details. 2 weeks from Thursday." James asked no questions. He never did. "One more thing," Ethan said. "Pull Maya Bennett's full employment file, everything, and get me her original documentation for the Traveler First program, the actual source files, with metadata showing authorship and creation dates." The metadata was unambiguous. The program had been created in a shared company drive folder under Maya's employee credentials 14 months ago. Victor's version, the one submitted to regional leadership, had been created in a separate document 11 days later, with text that matched Maya's original at a 93% similarity rate, as confirmed by the legal team's document comparison analysis. 93%. He had stolen her work with a 7% revision rate and collected $4,000 and a plaque for doing it. In the 2 weeks before the meeting, Ethan returned to his normal life with a surface composure that impressed even Carol, who knew him better than most. He attended board meetings. He reviewed quarterly projections. He approved a fleet expansion proposal. He smiled at the right moments in the right rooms and gave no indication to anyone outside his small circle that anything unusual was happening. But every morning, he woke up thinking about Rivergate. He thought about Desmond's disappeared report, about the elderly veteran who had felt invisible for the first time in 50 years of flying, about the mother and the stroller and the 2 crew members who walked past her twice, about the secret language of priority faces and time drains spoken casually in a galley at 30,000 feet by people who had been so thoroughly shaped by their environment that cruelty had become vocabulary. And he thought about Maya, who had somehow survived 6 years inside that environment without becoming it. That, to him, was the most remarkable thing, not Victor's corruption. Corruption in positions of unchecked power was ugly but not surprising. What was remarkable was that Maya had watched her work get stolen, her evaluations get quietly sabotaged, her colleagues mock her kindness as professional weakness, and had still shown up, had still crouched down for the crying child, had still crossed into someone else's cabin section to help a mother who expected nothing from anyone. He didn't know how people did that. He wanted to understand it better. He suspected it had something to do with why she'd written the program in the first place. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because there was a reward attached, but because she had looked at the gap between what Blue Horizon claimed to be and what it actually was at Rivergate, and found that gap personally unacceptable. She had tried to close it from inside, with no authority, no budget, and no protection. And she had nearly succeeded before someone with all three of those things took what she built and put his name on it. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and overcast. Ethan flew into Rivergate on an early connection. Economy class again, out of habit, and something approaching principle now. He sat in 31A, window seat, and watched the city appear below through a layer of thin cloud. He thought about the first time he had ever landed at an airport as a passenger rather than a pilot 31 years ago. Terrified and determined in equal measure, certain of nothing except that he wanted to build something that mattered. He thought he had, he still believed he had, underneath everything, but buildings require maintenance, and the people who maintain them require oversight, and oversight requires a willingness to look at what's actually there rather than what the reports say should be there. He had stopped looking closely enough. That was his failure, and he owned it fully, and it sat in his chest like something with weight. It is not defined by it. He cab dropped him at the Rivergate conference facility at 8:40. He entered through a side door that James had arranged access to and spent 30 minutes in a small anteroom reviewing the final evidence package with Carol and two members of the legal team. The screens in the main conference room were already loaded. The documents were already queued. Witness statements from Desmond, from Suki, from 4 other employees who had agreed to go on record were already formatted and ready. At 9:15, the conference room began to fill. Victor Kane walked in at 9:22, laughing at something one of his managers had said in the corridor. He wore a well-pressed shirt and the easy confidence of a man who had been called to performance reviews before and had always left them unscathed. He took a seat near the center of the table, nodded to the corporate executives already seated, and reached for the water pitcher without urgency. The screens were blank. The room settled. Then the doors at the back of the conference room opened. Victor looked up, and the laugh, the confidence, the easy reach for the water pitcher, all of it left his face in the same instant, replaced by something Ethan recognized as the specific expression of a person who has just understood, completely and irreversibly, that the ground beneath them is no longer solid. Ethan walked to the front of the room. He did not rush. He had waited 27 years to build this airline and 4 weeks to reach this moment, and he was not going to rush it now. He set his leather folder on the table, looked out at the room, and let the silence do its work for a few long seconds before he spoke. "My name," he said quietly, "is Ethan Mercer. Some of you know that. Some of you are meeting me for the first time." He paused, "and at least one of you believed he would never have to meet me at all." He did not look at Victor when he said it. He didn't need to. The room was absolutely still, not the polite stillness of a meeting waiting to begin, but the held breath stillness of people who have suddenly understood that what they walked into and what they are actually inside are two completely different things. Several managers exchanged glances. 2 of the corporate executives sat straighter in their chairs. Victor Kane had not moved since Ethan entered the room. He sat with both hands flat on the table, his water glass untouched, his earlier confidence dissolved so completely, it was difficult to believe it had ever been there. Ethan nodded to the screen operator. The first slide appeared. It was not a graph. It was not a performance metric. It was a photograph, a printed screenshot of a customer complaint submitted 14 months ago by a passenger named Raymond Okafor, who had described being spoken to by a Blue Horizon gate agent in a tone he characterized as deliberately demeaning and racially motivated. Beneath the screenshot was a second image, the complaint's status in the management system. Reclassified, operational delay, closed after 90 days, no action taken, no response sent. Ethan let it sit on the screen for 10 full seconds. Then, the next slide, another complaint. Same pattern, then another, then another. 12 complaints in sequence, each one a real person, each one a real experience, each one processed through Victor's system and quietly, efficiently rendered invisible. The room watched in a silence that grew heavier with each slide. Then came the emails, internal correspondence between Victor and two of his senior agents, discussing which employees were aligned and which were problems. Shift assignment records showing the systematic preferencing of his inner circle. Performance review documents with alterations visible in the metadata. Scores changed after initial submission, comments added or removed. The digital fingerprints of manipulation preserved perfectly in the version history that Victor had apparently not known existed. Then the Traveler First program documents appeared side by side on the split screen. Maya's original, time-stamped 14 months ago, created under her employee credentials. Victor's submission to regional leadership, created 11 days later, 93% identical. 2 documents, 1 author, 1 name on the bonus check. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at the screen for a long moment, then looked at Ethan with the expression of a man assembling a defense in real time, still searching for the angle that might save him. He found none. There was no angle. The evidence had been compiled by a legal team with 4 years of records and 2 weeks of preparation, and it was as complete and unambiguous as anything Ethan had seen in nearly 3 decades of running a company. An airline, Ethan said, his voice steady and unhurried, is not defined by its aircraft. It is not defined by its on-time departure rate or its fuel efficiency or its quarterly revenue figures. It is defined entirely and only by how it treats the people who trust it with their time, their money, and their safety. He paused. Every single person who buys a Blue Horizon ticket is extending us an act of trust. They are choosing us. And what happened in this hub, under this management, was a systematic betrayal of that trust. Not once, not accidentally, repeatedly, deliberately, and with enough organizational sophistication that it evaded detection for years. He looked around the room, slowly. That ends today. What followed was not dramatic in the way that confrontations in films are dramatic. There was no shouting. There was no moment of theatrical collapse. Victor said almost nothing. A single attempt at an explanation that Carol stopped with a quiet word and a reference to the legal team's presence. 2 of his senior managers, the ones most directly implicated in the complaint reclassification process, sat in a silence so complete it communicated everything. The corporate executives asked 3 questions, received 3 documented answers, and then the room moved into the procedural gravity of consequence. Victor Kane was placed on immediate suspension, pending formal termination. 2 senior managers were suspended alongside him. The remaining staff were informed that a full, independent review of Rivergate operations would begin within the week, conducted by an external team with no prior connection to the hub. Every complaint that had been reclassified over the past 4 years would be reopened, reviewed, and responded to personally. Every employee who had submitted a concern that disappeared into Victor's system would be contacted directly. Ethan announced 5 structural reforms before he closed the meeting. All promotion decisions above entry level would now require independent review from a panel that included no direct line managers from the candidate's hub. Anonymous complaints would route directly to a corporate oversight inbox with mandatory 48-hour acknowledgement and 30-day resolution requirements. Quarterly undercover service audits would become standard practice across all hubs, not punitive, but structural. The way any serious organization stress tests its own systems. Employee innovation submissions would be logged with authorship metadata at the point of creation, making the kind of theft that had been done to Maya institutionally impossible going forward, and customer treatment scores, not operational metrics, not departure rates, but actual human experience ratings, would constitute 30% of every hub manager's performance, evaluation, and bonus calculation. He folded his leather folder closed. Blue Horizon was built on a belief, he said, that every traveler deserves dignity. That sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires daily commitment from every person in this organization, from the people loading luggage at 5 in the morning to the people sitting in this room. When that commitment breaks down, when leaders decide that protection of their own position matters more than the promise we made to our passengers, the whole thing breaks down with it. What you saw on those screens today is what that breakdown looks like up close. He stood. I don't intend to see it again. He left the room before Victor did. He didn't watch him go. 3 months passed. They passed the way. Significant months do. Quickly in memory. Slowly in the living of them. The external review at Rivergate took 6 weeks and produced a report that confirmed everything Ethan's investigation had found and added several things it hadn't. New leadership was installed. New training was introduced. The complaint reclassification practice was found to have affected not dozens, but hundreds of passenger submissions over 4 years, and the process of individually reopening and responding to each one was the kind of painstaking, unglamorous work that no one outside the organization would ever fully see or appreciate, which made Ethan respect the team, doing it all the more. The Traveler First program was formally credited to its author and relaunched system-wide under her name. And Maya Bennett was offered a role that had not previously existed at Blue Horizon Airways, Director of Passenger Experience, reporting directly to the Chief Operations Officer, with a mandate to evaluate and redesign the passenger service model across all 63 aircraft and 8 hubs. She accepted on a Tuesday afternoon in the same terminal where she had once been mocked by colleagues for being too nice for the industry. Ethan heard about her acceptance through James. He was in a board meeting when the message came through, and he read it under the table, and something shifted in his chest that had nothing to do with quarterly projections. On a Thursday morning in early spring, 11 weeks after the Rivergate meeting, he flew again. Economy class, window seat, no name that meant anything to anyone in the terminal. He wore the same grey jacket, the same worn leather shoes. He stood in the same check-in line, waited with the same patience, moved through the same security checkpoint. He bought a coffee from the same airport cafe and carried it to his gate and sat down and watched. What he saw was not perfection. He was not naive enough to expect perfection, and he would have been suspicious of it if he'd found it. What he saw was effort, genuine, visible, imperfect, human effort directed consistently toward the right things. He saw a gate agent notice an elderly passenger struggling with his carry-on and move without hesitation to help him. He saw a crew member make eye contact with a young woman traveling alone and ask simply and warmly if she needed anything before boarding. He saw family with 3 small children greeted at the gate, not with the barely concealed impatience he remembered from 4 months earlier, but with the kind of practical kindness that costs nothing and means everything. He saw economy passengers treated like they mattered, because they did. They always had. He boarded last the way he always did Undercover and found his seat and settled in. A flight attendant moved through the cabin doing pre-departure checks. She stopped at his row, smiled directly at him. Not the professional performed smile he remembered from Flight 728, but something more natural, more present, and asked if he was comfortable. He said he was, thank you. She moved on. He looked out the window at the tarmac, at the ground crew working in the early morning light, at the Blue Horizon tail fin visible on the aircraft beside them, the pale blue and white livery he had chosen himself 27 years ago, because he wanted it to look like open sky. Then he saw it, posted at the gate behind the boarding desk, visible through the aircraft window at just the right angle, was a sign he hadn't authorized and hadn't known about, printed simply, framed plainly, hung at eye level where every single passenger would pass it on the way to their seat. Every traveler matters. 4 words. The same 4 words, essentially, that he had written into the first employee handbook he had ever printed in a rented office with second-hand furniture and a turboprop he couldn't quite afford. When Blue Horizon Airways was a belief more than a business, he stared at it for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and sent Maya Bennett a single message. It said, "I saw the sign. Thank you." She replied 4 minutes later, somewhere between the gate and 30,000 feet, with 3 words that told him everything he needed to know about the kind of person she was and the kind of company Blue Horizon could still become. She wrote, "It was always true." The aircraft pushed back from the gate. The engines rose. The runway rushed beneath them and then fell away. And Blue Horizon Flight 412 climbed through the early morning sky, carrying its passengers, each one of them, in every cabin, in every seat, into the open blue. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for more. We put out new stories every week that remind us what real leadership, real courage, and real human decency actually look like. Hit the like button if Maya's story moved you, and drop a comment below telling us about a time someone treated you with unexpected kindness. We read every single one.